Today's daf is daf Kuf Beis, and we'll begin where we left off on Kuf Aleph Amud Beis, about halfway through the Amud, and we're up to, let me just see where the place is, V'halo Pinchas. So the first word in the line is Aninus. If you take a look up and down the line on Kuf Aleph Amud Beis, it's right above the Tosas V'idach. And we learned yesterday that according to Reb Nechemia, the reason why Aaron burnt the chatos was because of Aninus. He and his two sons were in a state of Aninus after the loss of Nadav Avihu. And an Onen is enjoined from eating kodshim, and there's no one else on the face of the earth who is a Kohen other than the three Onenim, and therefore no one will be able to eat the basar of the korban chatos, and therefore we have to get rid of the chatos. It's torn streifa. It needs to be burnt. So those who disagree with Nehemiah, meaning Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, they fire a bunch of questions at Nehemiah. One of which is, if the problem was aninus, so why couldn't they wait until Lila? They didn't have to destroy the carbon. They could have waited till the Lila, because Aninus is only biyom mar on that day and not on the night after that day. So to that, Nehemiah responded and he said, no, my opinion is that Aninus is tofes lelo kiyomo, that the night afterwards is Asur Bekodshim Mitzad Aninus Do'oraisa, and that's an Isa Do'oraisa, so therefore it wouldn't help at all to wait till after the day ends. And then Rabbi Yehuda of Shimon asked a second question against Rabbi Nechemia, and that is that according to Nehemiah, why is it that they burnt only the chatos of Rosh Chodesh and they didn't burn the other two karbonos that were brought on the Yom HaMiluim, which was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, but they only destroyed and pasaled the carbon chatos, the soil chatos of Rosh Chodesh, but not the other karbonos, which were in fact brought on that day, even though they were owning it. So to answer that second question, Nehemiah put forth the argument that there's a fundamental difference between Kodshei Shah and Kodshim Ludoros. There was a heter, in fact, that would permit the Kohanim to eat the basar of the karbonos, even though they're onanim, but that heter was limited to Kodshei Shah, says Nehemiah, meaning to those special karbonos that were brought for the purpose and were generated by the dedication of the Migdah, of the Mishkan. But the soil Rosh Chodesh, that's Kodshei Doros. That has nothing to do with Shah. That's not generated by the moment of Miluim. And therefore, that carbon is not subject to any heter, and an onen is enjoined from eating that carbon. Therefore, they had to burn the soil Rosh Chodesh and only the soil Rosh Chodesh. Now we're ready for the third question, which Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon fire at Rabbi Nechemia. Why are you telling me that because they were onanim, they had to burn the korban chatos of Rosh Chodesh, namely that there was no other kohen on the face of the earth that was not an onen who could possibly eat the chatos? What about Pinchas? The Torah testifies that Pinchas himself ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, was a Kohen, and he was not an Onen, and therefore he should have been the one chosen to eat the carbon chatas. Why did you have to burn it? So the Gemara says, Shaper ka'amole. How is Reb Nechemia going to argue against this very fundamental objection? And the Gemara answers that Nechemia savra lo k'Reb Elazar. The Omer Reb Elazar, Omer Reb Chanina, lonis kahen Pinchas ad shehargo lezimri. Tichsiv v'haisa lo lezaro achrav bris olam kunas olam. When was Pinchas Niskadesh sanctified by Kedushas Kahuna? Only after the Maisa of Cosby and Zimri, when he did the Maisa Kanos and he killed them. And then the Pasuk says in that parsha that in the aftermath and as a result, as a reward for Pinchas's great act of zealotry, which saved the lives of many Jews, he was granted kahuna. But until that moment in time, he was not a Kohen. So therefore, on the day of Miluim, which is before the whole episode of Zimri ben Salu, he, meaning Pinchas, was not a Kohen. Rav Ashi wants to offer an alternative answer. Ad shesom sholem ben Ashvat. So at the end of Sefer Yoshua, we are told a story about Reuven and Gad. These were the Shvatim that remained on the other side of the Yarden, on the eastern side. They didn't cross over to the western side. And it says that when they settled in the land, they built a Mizbeach. They really meant it for the good purpose. They wanted to remind themselves that they were still part of Klal Yisrael, that even though they were separated from Klal Yisrael by the Yarden, nevertheless, so the Shvatim accused them falsely of building a Mizbeach because they wanted to bring Karbanos. Now, we bring Karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash or in a Mishkan, but not somewhere out there in the territory of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. So they decide to go to battle and raise a war of a militant, battle of soldiers against Reuven and Gad. And the one who made peace between them was Pinchas. Pinchas came along and he separated the sides and he explained to the Shvatim that that Reuven and Gad had no ill intent, and that's how he made peace. And at that point, Shenemar, it says in Sefer Yeshua, Yishma Pinchas HaKohen Nesiya Eidav Rosh Elfei Yisrael. Pinchas is called a Kohen, meaning until this point he was not a Kohen. He became a Kohen as a reward for making peace amongst the Shvatim. V'idach Nami. Okay, so Rav Ashi, very nice, but Hoksiv V'Oisalo Ulazara Achra, way back at the episode of Zimri, when Pinchas took a Romach and he killed Zimri, at that point it says Hoisalo Bris Kulas Olam. So why are you telling me that he didn't become a Kohen until way later when he made peace amongst the Shvatim? And the Gemara answers Kiksiv Hahu Bibracha Hu Diksiv. When it says in the aftermath of Zimri, V'Hoisalo Lazara Achrov, it didn't mean that Pinchas became a Kohen at that moment in time. It was just a bracha, a blessing from Shamayim, promising Pinchas that his zera, his offspring, would be Kohanim for forevermore. Ve'idach Nami. What about Rabbi Lazar? I mean, what's he going to say about the pasuk in Yoshua that for the first time Pinchas is called a Kohen after he made peace amongst the Shvatim? Haksiv Vayishma Pinchas HaKohen. So he was only called a Kohen then after he made peace. Hahuli Yache Zaro Achrav. Meaning that although God had granted kahuna, according to Rabbi Lazar, to Pinchas at the time of Zimri, but the fulfillment of Zaro Achrav, that his offspring, his progeny, would be Kohanim, that didn't take place until after he made peace amongst the Shvatim. Amar Rav, Moshe Rabbeinu Kohen Gadol, v'chol ipakotzi Shemayim hoye. According to Rav, Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of a Kohen Gadol. And Rav is going to establish that based on a pasuk. And this is going to be a segue into our sugi because, according to Rabbi Nehemiah, there was no other Kohen on the face of the earth. Well, what about Moshe? Moshe was not an onen. I mean, true that he lost his nephews and they were burnt to another avir, but he was not an onen. So why are you telling me they had to burn the basar of the soyer of Rosh Chodesh because there was no other Kohen? Shenemar, how does Rav know this? It says in Vayikra Perek Ches, "May el hamiluim lemoshe hoya lemona." So the Gemara says, Meisvei, how can you tell me that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen Gadol? I'm going to ask you a kasha from a brisa. We already saw this brisa. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon asked a kasha on Rabbi Nehemiah. How can you tell me that the reason why Aaron burnt the soil of Chatzor Rosh Chodesh is because all the Kohanim on the face of the earth were owning him? Fellow Pinchas Hayimayim, that was the third question that they raised against Rabbi Nehemiah. V'yim Isa. And now if you're going to tell me that Rav is correct and Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of a Kohen Gadol, Lema, why did Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon raise a different objection against Rabbi Nechemia? Forget about Pinchas right now. Hello, Moshe Rabbeinu Hayimayim. So the Gemara answers, Dilma Shani Moshe de Torah B'Shchina. It could be that although Moshe Rabbeinu was in Gavra, meaning the status as a result of his Minui meaning when you appoint him, he was appointed as a Kohen Gadol. That's true, but before, in actuality, he didn't have time to deal with any of the kachim and eat the karbanos or anything like that because he was too busy. Let's say, for example, in Har Sinai, he was up in Har Sinai from the morning, the break of dawn until the evening. He was always involved. He was tired with the Shekhinah, and therefore he didn't have time to eat the kachim. Diomar Moshe Bashkama Ola Ubashkama Yoret. He went up very early to Har Sinai, came down very late. He was busy learning Torah, mipi agvura, mipi ashchina. Meisvei, the Gemara now asks another objection against Rav. The pasuk says in Vayikra Chaf Aleph with regard to a balmum, a kohen who's a balmum. Lechem Elohov mikodshei hakadoshim umin hakadoshim yeyochel. That even though the balmum does not qualify to do the avoda, but he does have kedushas kuna le'inyan for eating all the basar of the kodesh, whether it's the kodesh, kodesh, kodesh kalam or kodesh kodeshim. Im nemru kodesh kodeshim. So the Brisa asks a very simple question. If you've already told me at the beginning of the pasuk that lechem alakov mi kodesh kadoshim yochal, why did you have to add u min hakadoshim, meaning kodshim kalam? If a kohen balmum is allowed to eat the basar of kodesh kodshim, then how much more so is he allowed to eat the basar of kodshim kalam that are on a lower level of kedusha? And v'yimnemru kodshim kalam, and once the Torah had to teach me that even though he is a balmum, nevertheless he's allowed to eat the basar of kodshim kalam. Lo menera kodshim kodshim. I mean, why would I make a distinction between kodshim kalam, kodshim kodshim? Apparently, if the balmum, the kohen balmum, can eat kodshim kalam, it means that mum does not disqualify a kohen from eating kodshim. So I would therefore apply it logically by analogy to the case of kodshim kodshim. And the word answers the following. The Brisa answers the following. Ilu lo nemar kodshim kalim. This is wild. Hayisi over, I would have said kodshim kodshim shehutal lezar. That dafka kodshim kodshim would a balmum be allowed to eat the basar kodesh, because I'm going to prove to you that kodshei kodshim are kal and kodshei kalim are chamur, and I'm going to prove that from the halacha of hutrol zar. That means a non-kohen is allowed to eat from kodshei kodshim. You hear this, but not from kodshim kalim. Counterintuitive. Kodshim kalam lo yochel. Okay, we're going to have to figure out what this means, and under what circumstances can a zar who's not a kohen eat from the basar of kachim kachim, and that has to do with the sugi of bama. Shehuchu zar vilahen aval kachim kalim lo yoyachel, because there's no situation in which a non-kohen can eat kachim kalim. And this is interesting because there's something called chazav v'shok, and that belongs to kachim kachim. Ve'ilo nemar kachim kachim, ayisiyomi v'kachim kalim yeh ochel shem kalim. Like we said intuitively, that maybe the Torah allowed a Balmum to eat kachim kalim, but not aval kachim kachim lo yeh ochel, because kachim kachim is that much more chomer, more strict and stringent. Lakach nemru kachim kachim, lakach nemru kachim kalim. Ktonim yisharei hutru lizar v'lohem. What we want to get out of this price is one point, and that is that a Balmum is allowed to eat kachim kachim. So the Gemara now in the Hamina thinks that what is this scenario, what is this situation in which a Balmum is allowed to eat from kachim kachim? Lav, shouldn't we say that it's referred to Moshe? At the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the only individuals that were allowed to eat kachim kachim were Aaron and Elazar V'Itamar and his two sons. And yet, the Torah allowed Moshe Rabbeinu to eat from the kachim, which were kachim kachim. And Moshe Rabbeinu apparently has the status of a zar. How do I know that Moshe Rabbeinu has the status of a zar? Because it says Shehuchul Zar, and it's a reference to Moshe. So we see that Moshe is a zar. He's not a kohen gadol. Rav Sheshes lo. The Bryce doesn't have Moshe Rabbeinu in mind, but rather a bama zar, that in a bama a zar could be makriv a carbon, and not only that, he could eat the carbon and could omer yesh mincha bebama. So we have two issues here. One issue is whether a zar is allowed to be makriv in a bama, and we're going according to that opinion that a zar indeed can be makriv in a bama, and we want to know if he's going to be allowed, this zar, to be makriv a mincha in a bama. And if he can be makriv a mincha in a bama, then the assumption, and this is machlokas tanoim, and according to one man Yoma, which the Gemara is now invoking, a Kohen Bal Mum is permitted to eat mincha in a bama. I'm sorry, not a Kohen Bal Mum. I meant to say a zara, non-Kohen. And a mincha is kachim kachim. So when it says in the Brisa that kachim kachim is permitted to a zar, it's referring to a bama. Can't be referring to Moshe because we're holding now like Rav that Moshe was a Kohen Gadol. So who is this zar? Under what circumstances do we find a heter kachim kachim for achila zar? That's going to be in a bama. And according to Mandi Omar, that they brought a korban mincha on a bama, which is kachim kachim. Now, one thing that has to be understood here, which is a very profound question, is why in a bama was there a permission only for a permission for a zar only for kachim kachim and not for kachim kalim? But it could be that there is no scenario, there's no reality that would fit that bill. I'm just wondering if he points that out here in the note. He says that chazav is shok shem chelik hakona b'kodshim kalim li olam ein zar muter li ochlam. Okay. So again, just the bottom line that we have to take out of this sugya is that kodshe kodshim has a heter for a zar to eat it in a case of a bama, and we right, and it's assuming that they were makriv a mincha and a bama, and there's no situation at all in which a zar could be allowed to eat from kodshim kal. So therefore, it's not enough for the Torah to allow a balmum to eat from kodshe kodshim, because maybe the Torah was making kodshe kodshim, allowing kodshe kodshim to be eaten by a zar, and therefore the Torah likewise was makil and allowed a balmum to eat from kodshe kodshim. Therefore, the Torah had to go out of its way to add umin hakadosh, meaning kodshim kal. Mesve, another objection against Rav, who assumes that Moshe Rabbeinu had a status of a Kohen Gadol. Miriam, mi hisgira. The Brisa asks, when Miriam contracted Saras, which Kohen, because only a Kohen is allowed to do Hezker of a Mitzorah, which Kohen did actually did it? In Tomar Moshe's Gira, maybe you'll say that Moshe Rabbeinu himself, saw the nega, and with the Riyas nega decided that she has to be quarantined, that this is really a nega Saras. No, that's impossible. Moshe Zarhu, who the Brisa says explicitly that Moshe Rabbeinu is not a Kohen. So how could you, Rav, say that Moshe Rabbeinu is a Kohen Gadol when here the Brisa excludes him from Re'iyas Nega of Taras in the case of Miriam because he is a Zar? V'yein Zar Roas HaNegoyim, right? And we know that from the Parsha of Mitzorah that only a Kohen could determine a Nega Tzaras. V'im Tomar Aaron his Gira. The Brisa continues, what other possibility do we have? We have Aaron Karavhu. V'yein Karav Roas HaNegoyim. And this is based on a pasuk in Dvarim Chaf Aleph Al Piyam Shel Kohanim Yedin, and basically the Torah equates Re'iyas Kohen in Negoim to din, to judgment, and with regard to judgment, a karov, a close relative, is possible he's disqualified from judgment for his own relative. So if Moshe Rabbeinu would have been the one who was determining Miriam to be what? I'm sorry, starting again. If Aaron was the one who was determining that Miriam needs Hezger and her situation is out of its aras, then it's a brother testifying, so to speak, against his own sister, and that we cannot accept. Ain't Korovus Agra. Now, at this point, you have to ask, the Maharsha makes a big deal about this, if Ein Kohen Korov Roas HaNegoyim, so why was the Brisa toying with the possibility that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who was Mazgir Miriam? I mean, Moshe Rabbeinu was Miriam's brother, just like Aaron was Miriam's brother. Anyway. Who is the Kohen who supervised and right? And what's the word? Over something, and he oversaw the process of Hezger of the Tzaras of Miriam. It was none other than the Ribbon Shalom himself. Ani Kohen, God declares himself as a Kohen. Vani Masgira, I'm going to be putting her into quarantine, into Hezger. Ani Cholta, that's another stage in Tzaras. Vani Potra, and I'm going to determine whether or not, at what point, she no longer has the Neged Tzaras, and she can return to the Mach. Moshe Zar, V'ein Zeh Roas HaNegoyim. It excludes Moshe Rabbeinu from the candidacy of being Roa, the Nega of his sister Miriam, because he's a Zar. So how can you tell me, Rav, that Moshe Rabbeinu is a Kohen Gadol, or Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Shani Maros Negoim, the Aaron Ubodav Ksuvim V'Parsha. So if you look at Vayikra Yud Gimel, In the parsha of Nigei Tzoras, you'll see it only mentions Aaron Ubanov, specifically Aaron Ubanov. So even if I accept Rav's premise that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen, but not every Kohen it qualifies to see Negoim and to be Mazgir a Matzorah. So again, for Kol Dinei Torah, well, holding like Rav, Moshe Rabbeinu has the status of a Kohen, even a Kohen Gadol. But in Reyes Negoim, no. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't have that status because the Torah wouldn't have it its way to mention in the parsha only Aaron Ubanov to the exclusion of Moshe. Meisvei, another objection against Rav that Moshe was a Kohen Gadol. Chamesh Smachos Hois Elisheva. Elisheva was related to everybody. She was the daughter of Aminadav. She was the wife of Aaron. And therefore, number one, Yivama Melech, right? Her brother-in-law, which is a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu, because she's married to Aaron, is a Melech. By Hibishur Melech, we'll see later on the sugi about Moshe Rabbeinu and his status as a Melech. So that's one reason for her to jump for joy. I mean, you see from this Gemara that you have to feel joy for your brother-in-law's success. And Isha with a mapike, that means her husband, Kohen Gadol. I mean, Aaron, she's married to the Kohen Gadol. I hope that's a good thing. I mean, to be married to Kohen Gadol, I don't know. I never had it. Anyway, Binah, what about her son Eliezer? He was called the Skan Kohen Gadol. Ben Binah, Pinchas ben Elazar, her grandson, was Mashuach Milchama. Achia, her brother, was none other than Nachshon ben Aminadab, and he was the Nasi Shevet Yehuda. The Avela, but on that day she was mourning. Al Shnei Banea, for her two sons, Nadav Avihu, that died. But Ketani Mias, what do we see in this brisa? That Yivama, meaning her Yavam, which is Moshe, who's the brother of her husband Aaron, Melech. So why did the brisa focus on the simcha of Elisheva? That because Elisheva's brother-in-law was the Melech. What about the fact that he was the Kohen Gadol? Melech in, Kohen Gadol lo. And it's only Aaron, that's her husband, that's singled out as the Kohen Gadol. Ema, shall we say that what the Brisa has in mind is Afnach, means Moshe Rabbeinu, in addition to being a Kohen Gadol, which that itself would have generated the simcha of Elisheva as a sister-in-law, but in addition to that, to top the boot on the cake, he was also a Melech. Not bad to be both Melech and Kohen Gadol. Plus, he was the Navi Shelo, right? There was never a Navi like him. Lakom Navi Kemoshe. Oh, so he's got three status eye, if you could say that. On WhatsApp, he could. On Sunday and Monday, he'll do the status of Melech. On Tuesday and Wednesday, he'll do the status of Kohen Gadol. On Thursday and Friday, he'll write a status. Hey, I'm the Navi, the greatest prophet in Israel. Anyway, Kitanoi, Ema, Af, Melech. All right, fine. Kitanoi. Now we're going to quote a Machlokas Tanoim about what was the status of Moshe vis-a-vis Kohen Gadol. And this brisa that we're about to learn that presents a Machlokas Tanoim is dealing with the issue of, number one, ketzef, meaning whenever you find anger, is there always going to be some sort of impact of that anger whenever the Tanakh mentions anger, especially with regard to the divine being? And secondly, did Moshe Rabbeinu actually give a slap on the face to Paro? So it says, Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu was refusing for a whole week at the sneh to become the Goal Shal Yisrael. And the Pasuk says that after a while, this is getting ridiculous. Moshe Rabbeinu comes up with argument after argument against his receiving that great mission. And God gets angry at him. Rabbi Shua Kol Charon Af Sheva Torah Nemer Bo Rosha. Whenever it says in the Torah Charon Af that God was angry, there's always going to be some sort of repercussion. However, there's one exception. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha points out that for Zed, this case, where Moshe Rabbeinu incurred the anger of God, divine wrath, because he refused to become the Goal Shal Yisrael, Lo Nemar Bo Rosha. We looked through the Tanakh, we sifted through the Torah, the Chumash, we didn't find any Roshem, any impact, any punishment to Moshe Rabbeinu for the fact that he refused to take the position with one argument after the other. Now it's interesting. The Brisa, for some reason, is not satisfied with the fact that we don't find in the aftermath, in the psukim that follow the sneh, that God meted out any punishment to Moshe Rabbeinu for refusing the job. And that pasuk, for some reason, is not sufficient. The Omer and Reb Shimon Yochai Omer, he has another pasuk. Af ze nemer bo roshem. Don't bring this pasuk as a proof that there is such a thing as charon af without punishment. Because even in this case, Moshe Rabbeinu was punished, and the Kahuna Gedola was ripped out, was taken away from him and given to Aaron. Shenemar, it says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu addresses Moshe. He says, "Hello, Aaron Achicha Halevi." Initially, the plan was, in the divine scheme of things, Moshe was going to be the Kohen Gadol, Aaron was going to be the Levi, which actually Aaron is a Levi, but why doesn't it say that Aaron was the Kohen Gadol? Hello, Kohen Gadol. Here's what the pasuk means. Hashem is saying, I said in my initial plan, that you will be a Kohen, Moshe, but for who? And Aaron will get a secondary position, he'll be a Levi. But now that you incurred divine wrath for repeatedly refusing to take the job as Goal Shal Yisrael, is who Kohen v'ata Levi. You're going to get demoted, and the original plan is not going to come to fruition. And the original plan was that Aaron would be the Levi, you would be the Kohen Gadol Moshe. But now, because of the Charon Af, according to this opinion of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Moshe Rabbeinu lost, or shall we say, his Kahuna Gadol was ripped away from him and given to Aaron. So that's the result of the Charona. There's a lot of deeper meaning here that we're not even scratching the surface. Anyway, Chacham Omer Lo Niskavi Moshe Ela Shivas Yemei Miluim Bilvad. Those kind of the kahuna of Moshe Rabbeinu only lasted for 7 days, or shall we say 7 days leading up to the 8th day. V'yesh Omer Lo Paska Kahuna Ela Mizaro Shel Moshe. That when we say that God got angry and he took away the kahuna from Moshe, it means that he took away the kahuna from the sons of Moshe. But Moshe himself was a Kohen. Shenemar, Moshe ish Elokim, banav Yikaru al Shevet Levi. So again, the hafsaka, the negation of kahuna, only is on the children of Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu himself was a Kohen Gadol. And that's why it says that Banav, they'll be called Leviim, because they're not Kohen. The Omer, but I have another pasuk. As we said before, one pasuk is not enough. Moshe v'yar b'chanav v'shmuel b'kar Shmuel. So we see clearly that that Moshe is considered a Kohen Gadol. My v'omer, why was it necessary to bring a second pasuk? Asked the Gemara. Why shouldn't one pasuk in Divrei Yomim be sufficient? If I only had the pasuk in Divrei Yom, I would have said Lidoros hu dichsiv, that with regard to the generations and the progeny of Moshe Rabbeinu, they will not have the status of Kohen Gedolim, but it doesn't prove anything about Moshe. Therefore, we need the pasuk Moshe v'yar b'chonav that specifically, explicitly spells out that Moshe was a Kohen. Gemara says, "V'chol charon af shebetor never bosh maksiv v'yetzem im paro b'chari af v'lo omelo v'lo midi." Moshe, threatens Paro, and he says there's going to be a makkah at Chatzos Laila called Makas Bechoros, and Paro throws him out. And the pasuk testifies that Aaron was in a state of Charon Af. And yet we don't find that Moshe Rabbeinu said anything to Paro or punished him in any way. Omer Reish Lakish staro v'yatza. He didn't just stomp out of the office of Paro. He actually slapped Paro. I'm very much reminded of a video that I saw, I think it was yesterday, from Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson. Do you ever listen to him at all? No? He's a great Lubavitcher. I think he's one of the greats of the whole generation. Unbelievable speaker. So he tells a story about the grandmother of the recently appointed head of Shabak. I think his name is Zini or something similar, maybe I'm not pronouncing it. And his grandmother was witness in the Holocaust of a Nazi officer who wanted to show this woman who was not the grandmother that we're talking about, this other woman who was totally broken and she couldn't carry the workload. So the Nazi decided to do her under and sent a German shepherd to rip apart her flesh. Immediately, this woman, who's the grandmother of, slaps the Nazi twice on the face. Nazi pulls out his revolver and he couldn't shoot. Somehow it got stopped. And he determined that she would get 90 lashes. A frail, small woman. They brought her back to the barracks, blue like the summer sky. And she was unconscious for weeks. And somehow she snapped out of it. They hit her in the barracks and she snapped out of it. The first thing that came out of her mouth when she woke up from her coma was, "I have no regrets." Anyway, it says here that Moshe Rabbeinu slapped Paro across the face. However, not everybody agrees that this is so. Umi Omer Reish Lakish, I don't even think Reish Lakish said it. Haksiv, the pasuk says, "V'nitzavto likroso al sfas hayor," that you have to go out to greet the king, Paro, out there on the sfas hayor, on the banks of the Nile. V'yomer Reish Lakish melechu v'hasbil oponim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, this guy's a melech. You gotta treat him like a king. Obviously, according to Reish Lakish, Moshe Rabbeinu would not have slapped Paro across the face. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Rashahu v'heiz panav bo. In other words, according to Rabbi Yochanan, in this particular transmission, Moshe Rabbeinu saw Paro as the how should I say, the epitome of evil. And hay is part of bo. Moshe Rabbeinu did not have to show any kavod. So what does v'nitzavta likroso mean according to Rabbi Yochanan? Rashi says it means tisyatzev kenegdo limilchama. And that's called divrei azus, very strong, powerful word. I'm going to confront you in war. Which reminds me of the Rashi at the beginning of this week's parsha that Yehuda threatens Yosef that he's going to confront the king or the viceroy in war. Anyway, so April. So the Gemara says we're going to have to switch around the names, and actually Reish Lakish is the one who says hey is panav bo, and therefore he slaps him. And Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says, no, you have to give cover to the mill. A person should always have respect and reverence for the kingship. When Moshe says to Paro, what's going to happen after Makas Bechoros? He says, "V'yardu kol avodecha ele elai," that all your avodim are going to come running after me, bowing down to me and begging me to bring a cessation to this terrible Makah of Bechoros. And notice he mentions only avodecha, iludidei lo komer, but he deliberately omits mention of Paro. And that's because he should have Emas Malchus. Rabbi Yochanan Omar. I find Rabbi Yochanan says a different source for this same conclusion. So this is the story of Eliyahu Bahara Carmel. And he prays to Hashem to bring down the fire. Eliyahu brings down the fire from Shamayim, and it consumes the korban olah that he brought. And the entire Jewish nation responded with a cry, Hashem hu Elokim. Then there was a terrible famine, and the rains came down in a torrent in order to fulfill the prophecy that Hashem prophesied to Eliyahu. And now Achav, who is a very evil king, is riding on a chariot on his way to Israel, and the pasuk says, "V'yad Hashem hoisel Eliyahu vayishanes masnav vayaretz lifnei Achav." I mean, look at all this respect that Eliyahu gives to Achav, who doesn't deserve an inch of respect, but nevertheless, this is the halach of Tehei Emas Malchus Olech. Omar Ula Bikesh Moshe Malchus V'lo Nosnalo. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to become a melech, but according to Ula, God did not grant him his plea. Tichsiv, because it says in the Maseches Al Tikrov Halom, don't get too close over here, because you're standing on holy ground. V'ein Halom Ela Malchus. So Al Tikrov Halom, if we prove that the word Halom means Malchus, means don't even come towards Malchus. You're not going to be a melech. We saw already earlier that Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of a melech, but this is against Ula, and Ula says that with regard to, just one second, David HaMelech, that Nosan HaNavi tells David HaMelech that his offspring, his descendants, will serve as kings forever and ever, and that his son will build the Beis Hamikdash. Mi anochi Hashem Elokim, David responds, Umi Beisi ki avi osani ad halom. So David is being granted Malchus, and he says halom. So you see the word halom means melech. Masiv Rava is a kasha from a brisa that we quoted earlier, Rabbi Shmuel Omer Yivama Melech, right? One of the 5 reasons why Elisheva, who was the brother of Aminadav and the wife of Aaron, and the sister-in-law of Moshe, why was she besimcha? Because Moshe Rabbeinu was the king. Omar Rava lo Ula Zaraka. What Ula means to say is that Moshe Rabbeinu's beseeching God that the Malchus should pass through him and through his progeny Olam, and that's what Hashem denied him. But Moshe Rabbeinu himself was in fact the melech. And you want to interpret based on the pasuk by David HaMelech that the word halom always means for all generations. Right, the people of Israel came to beseech Moshe Rabbeinu to appoint a king. To beseech Shmuel Hanavi to appoint a king. The first king was Shaul, and everybody gathered together in a place called Mitzpeh. Shmuel set up a gorol, meaning a lottery, and the gorol determined that indeed Shaul who was called Nichbal HaKelim, he was a very humble person, would be the first king in Israel. And Ichsiv Haba Od Halom Ish. And here the word Halom is referring um, to Shaul, and Shaul will not carry on the Malchus for all generations. Adarabba, David is going to become the Melech. So the Gemara gives a few answers. Iboy say one answer I could give you is Ha'hava. That in truth, the son of Shaul did sit on the throne. He was the king, and his name was Ish Boshes. Now, Ish Boshes served as king of Israel for 2 years after the death of his father Shaul. But at least we see that Halom, to some extent, is fulfilled in the next generation. Ibai say, I have a better answer for you. That the word Halom, although it generally means Lidoros for all generations, Shani Shol Dafilu Begave Lo Kim, that the Malchus was ripped off of Shaul even during Shaul's lifetime. So the kiyum of Malchus, not only was it excluded from Shaul's offspring, his descendants, but even from Shaul himself. And that's based on a rule that a person could do wrong, and as a result, he could remove himself from the great status that God granted him. Kid Rabbi Elazar, Omer Abchanina B'Shosha Poskim G'du Lo Poskim Lo Lazar at Sof HaDoros. Although it's true that initially, when a person is granted a reward, that reward is for all generations. Shenem Lo Yigra Mitzadik Einov Es Malach Lakise V'Yoshiveu L'Netzach V'Yigbo. So when a Kodesh Baruch Hu makes a person a melech, then it's L'Netzach, the pasuk says, for all eternity. But Hegis Daito HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mashpilo. If he lets it get to his head and it swells him up too much, then as a result of that gaiva, of that haughtiness, God will sink him down, so to speak. Shenemar V'im Asurim B'Zikin Yilochtun B'Chavle Oni. You know, as if you see Asurim B'Zokim, Zikin means chains, and the person is suffering, the only thing that could have caused such suffering, you should know, is haughtiness, is Gavus Halev. And now we start the Sugi of Bali movement. Okay. So we have another, shall we say, 10, 15 minutes. Let's see if we can get into the Sugi of Bali movement. Right? The Gemara quotes the Mishnah Bali Mumim, Bein Bali Mumim, Kvuim, Bein Bali Mumim, Ovrim, Cholki, Bekarbonos, V'Ochlim, Bo. So although a Balmum is excluded from doing the Avoda, but nevertheless he's part of the Achilas Kodshim, and he's part of the Chalukah, and they will give him a share if he's in that family of the Mishmar, etc., etc. Binani Mili, how do we know that the Balmum, although he's excluded from Avoda, nevertheless he can eat the Kodshim? The Tanur Rabbanim, we learned to the Bryce based on a pasuk with regard to the Korban Mincha in Vayikavav. Kol Zachar, we'll read the whole pasuk, Bivnei Aaron Yochlena. So why does the Torah add the word Kol Zachar? Every male amongst the children of Aaron will eat the Kodshim. Is L'Rabos Bali Mum. Lemai Ilachila. Shrei Nemar, Lechem Elokov Mikodshei HaKodshim Yochal. We already have a pasuk that indicates explicitly that a Kohen Balmum is allowed to eat from the Kodshim. So why did the Torah have to repeat it? Ella, the Torah is telling us now in this extra pasuk L'Chaluka that when the Kohanim divide up the meat, the Balmum, has a schus mamon to get part of the meat. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa. Kol Zachar L'Rabos Bali Mumim Lemai Lachila Harei Kfar Nemar L'Chaluka Kfar Omur. So this brisa holds that we already know that l'chaluka the balmum gets a division, a portion in the kachim. So what do I need the pasuk? Sheyachal, I would have thought that ein li ella tam v'nasamud. Oh, there are two situations of a balmum. There's one person who was initially at the time of the avodas hakarbon, he was a sholem, he was a tam. He became a balmum afterwards, and that's called Tom Vinasim Balmum. But what about the following case, which is much more extreme? Balmume Ikaro. At the, at the time when they did the avoda and started divvying up the basar, he was already a Balmum at that time. Tamaloma Kol Zachar, if I need this third pasuk, the Ribi of Kol Zachar, Tanya, either way, another brisa, and this is referring to the parsha of Asham, and it says in the parsha of Vayikra Zayin, Kol Zachar Yochlenu, L'Rabbos Bali Mum. Lemai, what is it? What is it teaching me about Mum? If it's teaching me Lachila that he's allowed to eat from the Kodshim Arei Kvar Nemar, we already know that. We derived that from a apostle. And if lechaluka harei kvar nemar, we already derived that from a pasuk. Lebalmumi karo. If you're going to tell me that he was a balmum from the get go, that's impossible. Harei kvar omur. So what's this pasuk coming to teach me? Yachal, I could have entertained the idea ein li. When do we say that the balmum gets a chelek as they divvy up the kodshim? Ella balmum kavua. Have a balmum over minayin tavaloma kol zochar. Makes no sense. Papilai, just the opposite. Tell me first that a balmum over could eat kosher, and then tell me another chiddush that a balmum she'ena kavua she'ena over, even though he's always going to be balmum, there's no hope for him. Rav Sheshes April, you have to turn it around. So it means that the Brisa is really saying that I might think it only applies to a balmum over as a temporary balmum, and we need the kol zocher to teach me that even if it's a permanent mum that can never be remedied, then nevertheless he can still eat the kodshim. Rav Asher Malon Tepach. I'm going to take it at this. Salke Dait I would have thought. Here we turn to Kuf Beis Omid Beis. We have another few minutes, not too much. Ki Tame. That we should equate the status of a balmum with that of a tummy, a kohen tummy. Ma tummy, just like if a kohen contracts tuma, is kama de lo tahar lo ochil, as long as he remains tummy, he's not allowed to eat from kodshim af hai nami. So too a kohen is balmum over, which means it's going to remedy itself. Kama de lo misakin lo ochil, but as long as he's what? He's in that state of a balmum, because it hasn't yet passed, is then we're not going to let him eat the kodshim, kamash malon, if I need an extra pasuk to teach me that even in the case of a balmum over, and right now he's still a balmum, we're not going to wait until his mum leaves. Kol sheinu roy lavoda in a chol basar. If a kohen is not roy lavoda, he doesn't eat from the basar. What are you going to do with balmum? Hare balmum de lo roy lavoda. He can't do the avodas hakarbon, and yet cholik he gets part of the visu. And furthermore, it seems from the Mishnah that royal avoda cholek. Wait a minute, that's not always so. You're going to tell me that if he's royal avoda, he gets part of the basar. Hare tami bekarbanos tzibur royal avoda v'eno cholek. Right, and there's a special din in a korban tzibur that even a kohen tummy is allowed to do the avoda, and yet the halach is he doesn't get any part of the meat of the korban. So Gemara answers royal avoda ka'omar. When the Tana Kama had it in mind, he had in mind someone who's royal achila ka'omar. I'm sorry, I read it wrong. Royal achila ka'omar. And we're going to read the Mishnah Kol she'eno royal achila eno cholek. But about Mum is royal achila, and therefore he's cholek. Now, a tummy is not royal achila, and therefore even though he can do the avodah of a korban tzibur, but he's not cholik because he's not royal achila. In fact, the Gemara kata the royal achila. Right, halach is that let's say, for example, in chatos, when the basar is designated for the zichrei kuna, they give it over to their family, the women and the small children, and yet he's not royal achila. I'm saying he's not royal avoda. A kohen doesn't do avoda. Ah, what the Gemara is saying here is that if you're royal achila, like the case of the kohen balmum, then automatically, ipso facto, you're cholik. That's not so, because it's not so that, again, balmum is royal achila. It's not so. A kohen katan is royal achila, yet he's not cholik. He doesn't have any monetary rights. And the Gemara answers, ha lo katani. We went a little bit too far, says the Gemara. It doesn't say that kol haroyal achila gets a chalukah. All it says is that if he's royal achila, he can be part of the chalukah, as opposed to a tameh who's not royal achila, and therefore he's not part of the chalukah. But it doesn't mean by definition that anyone who can eat from the basar kodshim is by definition he has the rights of chalukah. So a kohen could eat the kodshim, but he doesn't have rights to the chalukah. Hashtadas lahachi. Here's we're going to wrap it up. In other words, now that you came to this conclusion, is li olam kedama mikara, I can go back to the original interpretation that if someone is not royal avoda, then he's not zoche in the chalukah. Imishum tome, where we said that in a korban tzibur he's royal avoda, and yet he's not part of the chalukah. Tome lo ketani. The Tana doesn't mention anything about a kohen tame. What does that mean? Hatana lo is kaven shenedayik midvar shekol misha royal avoda cholik. All right. So in other words, the Bryce is only teaching us that if he's not royally avoda, then he's not cholik. V'mishum avoda, he's not royally avoda, yet he's cholik. Nachman Rabbi, there's a special ribui in the Torah, as we saw before, to include balmum in the achila. And afilu tomi b'shas rikas dam. Okay, that's in Mirz Hashem. But tomorrow. But right, let me just go over this. I think you said that